right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. This class is going to be the Ili Nishmat. We would like to dedicate the class Ili Nishmat Tal Bat Yitzchak. Who said this is the conclusion of the shivah of a very special girl who used to come to Maayon. May it speak to the discourse of her neshama. Okay, tonight we're going to learn a discourse from the Sefer Siddur Im Dach. It's the same author that we usually learn from, the Alter Rebbe, but this time we're learning from a different book. We're learning from his Siddur, in which is a compilation of the Siddur, which is the prayer book, but with the deep Chassidic teachings that Rabbi Zalman of Liadi, founder of Chabad Chassidism, said that these discourses based on Kabbalistic and mystical ideas on the various times of the year and different prayers. Today, we're going to focus on the significance of the three Shabbos meals. Shabbos, we're supposed to eat 3 meals. It's a mitzvah. And each meal has a different kavana, has a different energy to it. And we're going to see there's a progression of the meals, going from the lowest level to higher level and higher. And that's the significance of this powerful Shabbos meals. How was I led to this discourse this week? So it's interesting. And you see divine providence. I was thinking today, what am I going to teach? The Torah or Memarim we finished already, even though there's a lot on Parshas Yisro, we finished already. And it wouldn't hurt to learn them again, but for now I'm trying to record as much as I can that is not. So I was thinking, well, got to get creative. What else are we going to learn? What are we going to learn? I came over here thinking. And I tried to look at Biurei HaZohar. Thought maybe it is on Parshas Yisro. There's no Biurei HaZohar on Parshas Yisro. And then I said, you know what? Maybe there's something on Shavuos. Parshas Yisro is the time of the giving of the Torah. Maybe in the Siddur, there'll be a discourse on Shavuos. Shavuos and relating to the giving of the Torah. So there is a discourse on Shavuos, but they're not on Parshas Yisro. They're on the mitzvah of Sefirot, Svartam Lechem and Machas Shabbos. So I said, okay, not that. So then I looked in the Siddur and I said, hey, right in the beginning of the second volume, today they printed it into 2 volumes, there's a discourse on mikvah. And I said, hey, is that interesting? Last week, Thursday night, I was doing all my, by the Farbrengen, I was on a mikvah rant. That's because I said Al-Chaim and I was sharing with you all my intentions in the mikvah. So I said, hey, let me actually get past my intentions and let's look at what it actually says is the real kavanas of mikvah. So I tried learning that and I couldn't make heads and tails. I can't say I tried too hard. I didn't exert myself and I didn't try for more than 20 minutes, but it was a 20-minute attempt to read and I did not understand. So after a while, I gave up on that. And I continued looking and I said, oh, let's try this one. I said, oh, Shabbos meals, that's interesting. And I open up and I see, okay, it's a commentary on the Zohar. And I see that the Zohar that he's commenting on is Parshas Yisro. Not only that, in the bottom, it gives you when the Alter Rebbe said it. He said it on Shabbos Parshas Yisro. So here we are. Without intending, I landed to the maamar of Parshas Yisro, which this week is Parshas Yisro. And even though I would have thought this is more like a B'Shalach discourse, because in B'Shalach is the idea of the man and the Shabbos meals. So I would have thought this is I was almost sure this is a B'Shalach maamar. No, it's a Parshas Yisro maamar. The Alter Rebbe said this in the year 1807, Tav Kuf Samach Zayin, and he said it in the city of Mohilev, in the Ukraine, is where the Alter Rebbe said this discourse, Shabbos Parshas Yisro. Now this discourse is really, one we're going to learn today is only part 1. We're not even going to finish part 1, but we're going to probably learn this week and next week to finish part 1, which is this maamar. But this maamar itself is only a part 1 of a second discourse that's a little bit further and then a third discourse, which is part 3, which is a little further in the book. What that means is as follows. Since he's going to discuss the 3 meals, so in the maamar, he devotes one for the first meal, one for the second meal, and one for the third meal. A lot of it has to do with the passage of the Zohar explaining what the Zohar says about each meal. I think it's also going to explain some of what the Arizal's part of the Arizal song, which the Arizal made a composition that we sing by the meals. I'm not sure. I didn't really finish the later Maimarim. So we'll see when we get there. But it's going to deal with and give us an insight of the incredible dynamics of what a Shabbos, what the Shabbat meals mean, what the deeper spiritual significance of this elevated time and elevated experience. The first discourse that we're going to learn now is primarily not even going to deal with the Friday night meal. It primarily deals with the concept of the pleasure on Shabbos to begin with. And all the way in the end of the discourse, he introduces the Friday night meal. And then in the second discourse that hopefully we're going to continue, when we finish this one, is going to talk about the Shabbos day meal, and then Seudas Shlishit, the third meal. All these are going to be discussed probably in the next couple of weeks of learning. What else should we want to do than delve into Shabbos and submerge ourselves in the beauty of Shabbos? So here we are. He begins with the Zohar, Parshas Yisro. He begins by quoting the Zohar, Parshas Yisro, Daf P Amud Beis, on page 88 on the second side. Reb Shimon, Rabbi. So the Zohar says like this: Reb Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, Reb Shimon, the great Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, when he came to the meal, and probably doesn't say which meal, but I don't imagine that it talks about Shabbos. So when he came to the Shabbos meal, this is what he said: Askino Seudas. Let us set up a meal. Askino Seudas, prepare the meal. The Mehemnusa Ila'ah, for the elevated faith. Mehemnusa means faith. To the elevated faith. So that's a very, very supreme and high level called the elevated faith. Askino Seudas the Malka. Prepare the meal of the king. Now it's interesting that now you know where that or originates. We know that in our Shabbos meals, part of our liturgy of the meals, part of the Zemirot, what we say is, as I mentioned before, there is a piece of poetry that is Kabbalistic in nature, that is written by Rabbi Yitzchak, the great and saintly Ari, from the 1570. Okay, so and that's usually sung by all Chassidim, Sephardim, all those who follow a little bit more the mystical tradition. They sing that piece, or they say it before Kiddush. Some people sing it in the meal, say it in the meal, fine. But introducing that piece, before that piece, there is by all 3 meals, there is a 3-sentence paragraph, which begins with Askino Seudas, prepare the meal. And in that Askino Seudas, it mentions in all 3 meals they're a little different. It basically is attributing the meal to various different divine aspects. Here it says, make the meal to the apple, to the Chakal Tapuch and Kadishin, to the apple orchard. This is Askino Seudas the Malka, prepare the meal of the king. Uze'er Anpin, there's an air Anpin. Do Seudas Da'atika Kadisha, this is the meal of the holy Atik Yom, and ancient of days. So, but where does this language come from? Askino Seudas, who instituted this? So this is, you see from the Zohar. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai used to say this. He would say, prepare the meal. And we are now continuing the custom of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Probably a good thing to do. In any case, we say, Askino Seudas the Mehemnusa Ila'ah, prepare the meal of the higher faith. And Askino Seudas the Malka, prepare the meal of the king. He would sit and he would be happy. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai would delight. He would sit down and he would delight. I guess he delighted in just the ambiance of who's at the meal. I don't think he needed to get the pleasure from the Shabbos food. He was already in ecstasy just by knowing whose meal was there. Then, Kad Ashlim Seudas Lisa, when Reb Shimon Bar Yochai would complete the third meal, that means after he finished all 3 meals of Shabbos, have a machriza alayhu, he would announce upon it, Oz tis'aneg al Hashem, then you will delight on God. It's a verse. Where's the pasuk? Oz tis'aneg al Hashem. It is a verse in Isaiah, in Yeshaya. Nun ches Yudalet, chapter 58, verse number 14. It says, then you will delight upon God. And he will make you ride al bamsei aretz, on the elevated land, on the most elevated element of the earth. And he will give you to eat nachlas Yaakov avicha, the inheritance of Jacob, your father. So Reb Shimon Bar Yochai would quote that verse, but when he would wait, he would only quote this verse, Az Tesaneg al Hashem, after he was concluding the third meal every Shabbos. This was his custom. Amar Rebbe Elazar la'avihu la'avi lavuye. So Rebbe Elazar, we know Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had a son, Rebbe Elazar. So Rebbe Elazar says to his father, Ilin Sudasi Eich Mistaknin. These meals, how are they? Can you explain? Give me a little bit Chassidus on the meals. Give me a little more insight on these different meals. How do you set them up? Meaning, who's being invited? Who's the meal? Like, what are the spiritual or the divine elements of the meal? The divine makeup of the meal. Amalei. So Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, to his son, begins to expound on the differences of the 3 meals. And he says, Leila de Shabbat, that we have the dynamic of each of these meals are different. Leila de Shabbat, Shabbos evening, which means the Friday night meal. Regarding that verse, it says, I will make you ride on elevated earth. Which is the same verse that he mentioned earlier. But he says this particular part of the verse, I will make you ride al bamsei aretz, on the elevated earth, is referring to the first meal. Now we can stop right now and offer perhaps a little suggestion. I'm trying to guess what, I didn't learn this yet. Meaning I learned a little, but I didn't really learn the final explanation of what it means. But based on the concept, the idea that the Friday night meal is related to Malchus. It's related to the Shekhinah, to the level of the divine most assimilated and most integrated in earth, most part of creation. And we know that on Friday night, that level, the Shekhinah, rises together with the creation. Now that level of the divine is called earth. Elevated earth, when she's elevated. And Hashem is saying, I will have you ride al bamsei aretz, on the elevation of earth. So it would make sense that this belongs to the Friday night meal. Because we are in flight on the wings of the Shekhinah as she is rising upward. Again, this is my guess. But this is what, the way, okay? Amalei says, Leila the Shabbat, the eve of Shabbos, I will make you ride al bamsei aretz. I will make you ride on the elevated earth, Beib Balayla, in the night, in its night. Which night? The night of Shabbos. Mizbarcha Matrunisa, the queen is being blessed. Mizbarcha, she is blessed. She is being blessed. Who is being blessed? Matrinusa, the queen. So again, who is the queen? The queen is the level called Shekhinah. She's called the queen. She is being blessed on Friday night. The kulu chakal tapuchin, and the entire apple orchard. So it looks like we always know that when it says in the Zohar, Chakal Tapuchin Kadishin, the holy apple orchard, it is associated with Malchus. But over here in the Zohar, it seems to be implying that Malchus the Shekhinah. She's, for whatever reason, called the holy apple orchard. But over here, it seems to be saying that there is two elements here. There is Mehemnusa, the queen herself, and her company, I guess. Chakal Tapuchin Kadishin, the holy apple orchard, is something associated with her, an element associated with her, related to them, not exactly the Shekhinah itself, but somehow attached to her. And in addition to that, it becomes blessed. Psaire means, I think, the bread, or psaire means the table of a person. Every one of our tables get blessed. Our food gets blessed, and the table gets blessed. And an added soul, and a soul is added on to us. This all takes place Friday night. Friday night, one's table is blessed, and the neshama yesera, we know on Shabbos, the extra neshama is added on to every single person. Since the Shekhinah is blessed, when the Shekhinah becomes blessed, he's adding now, it's her delight. She's joyous. She has a very great happiness because of her blessing that is given to her. And therefore, and for that reason, a person needs to delight and be happy Friday night. And to eat the queen's meal. Friday night is the queen's meal, the meal of the Shekhinah. Later we're going to see Shabbos day is the king's meal. The Seudas Shlish is third level, as we're soon going to see. So this is the quote that he quotes from the Zohar. Now the Alter Rebbe begins to explain. Now before we begin to explain the idea of the three meals, let's first preface by explaining. Masha Kosov, this that it says, Az tisaneg al Hashem. It says then, simply it's referring to the time of the future, in the days of Mashiach, in the days of the redemption. Then you will rejoice al Hashem, upon Hashem. What does that mean? It was interesting lush. It should say Az tisaneg, simply it means then you will delight with God. But then it should say Az tisaneg im Hashem, with God. It says Az tisaneg, then you should delight al Hashem, on God. What does that mean, on God? Seem as if the person is on top of God. What does that mean? Mayu al. What does it mean, al on? Mashman implies lamayla m'shem Havayah. This implies that the pleasure that we experience is higher than Hashem's name. Even Hashem's most elevated name, which is the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is unimaginably high, yet we're saying the joy is above and beyond Havayah. Wow. So here you do to understand this, he begins to explain. Here you do it is known. In the explanation of the four letters of God's name. Because Hashem's Havayah, the tetragrammaton has four letters. Yud Kei Vav Kei. Hayud, so we know that each letter is symbolic of another one of the Sefirot. Hayud ubchenes ha-Chochmah. Yud always symbolizes Chochmah. But which Chochmah? Ha-Chochmah d'Atzilus. Chochmah is the first of the Sefirot. Chochmah is wisdom. But here's the Chochmah of the first world, which is a world of utter divinity, the world of Atzilus. Ki Hayud. Now why is Yud implying Chochmah? Ki Hayud ubchenes tzimtzum kenekuda echad bilvad. Yud is a point. Yud is all Yud is a dot, a decimal dot. That's all a Yud is, which and therefore we can understand why it's symbolic of Chochmah, because Chochmah is the beginning of God revealing himself in some form of context. Higher than Chochmah, Hashem is without any shape or form or any identity. And therefore, there's no revelation to the worlds. The worlds can't have revelation of Or Ein Sof beyond Chochmah. In order to have some sort of a revelation, God has to contract himself in some form of a contraction. He begins by revealing himself as a point. And then from that point, you can make Hashem continues to develop his light in a way that we can expand on that point, draw out whatever type of spiritual and godly manifestation. It comes through. But it always has to start with a yud. And therefore, the yud is b'chinas tzimtzum. First, there is a contraction, and Hashem diminishes his infinity down to a point, and then there's a spark. The point is like a spark. The yud is like a spark. And from that spark, sparks existence, whatever that is. And the reason now, but on the one hand, the fact that we're calling it a yud means there's already something. There's a point. But on the other hand, there is something about the point is that the point is still above any image. A dot, you don't know if it's going to be eventually, if it's going to be a circle, if it's going to be a line, if it's going to be a point in what. The point is very undefined. And that's where the energy of Chochmah is still so lofty that there's no grasping in it, because it has no, Hashem is not yet appearing in something that we can latch our minds on and grasp. All we know is that we see light, we see something. We can feel there is an energy, but it's still undefined. And that's the reason why Chochmah is called Koach Ma, the power of what? We sense an energy, but we don't know what it is. We sense a light, we sense a revelation, but it's still questionable. Ma, it's still what? It hasn't arrived yet to a state of asaga, grasping, and understanding, in expanding into spatial entities. Of orech means the length, v'rochav is the width, which what happens in the next stage. Because after the yud, what's the next evolution? It evolves into a hey. A hey has already shape and form. So in the hey, you can kind of get already a picture, you can begin to grasp. And therefore it's referring to bina. Bina means grasping, understanding. But the Chochmah is still elusive. It's still undefined, it's just that point. And the hey is already the bina of the world of Atzilus. Over here, there's already an expansion to length and to width. And that is referred to already as the broad river. Chochmah is called a spring, where you have just the essence, the water just spiking up from nowhere, from somewhere beneath the earth. We don't know the source. And you can see a little bit of water, just like a point. But then when it expands and gets broad, it becomes a river. Ki yadua, as it is known. And the Vav, again, we're following God's name. The Vav is a downward line, which represents taking the energy of Bina, which is still very lofty, and bringing it further down, closer to existence. And that is what happens, and therefore that produces the emotions of God. Because the emotions are God approaching and getting closer to the creation. In the intelligence, God is still very, very far above the world. In these emotions, like an emotion, when someone is only extending to you their intellect, but not their emotions, there's a lot of distance. But when a person is emotionally open to you, that means then there's closeness, there's love, there's attachment. Emotions are far more projected to the recipient, and in a more interaction, a closeness to the recipient, to the one that the emotion relates to. So in God's emotions, he's much closer to the world than in his intelligence. Chochmah, forget about it. No one has any grasp in that at all. Bina, we can at least grasp, but it's still far away. The Vav is the descending light, and Vav is also 6, because God descends through 6 emotions. Yeah. Midas, which are the Midas of Atzilus, that are born out of and they're drawn from the intelligence of Bina. Which Bina is called the mother of the sons. She's the mother of the emotions. And then finally we get to the last stage of God's name, the Hey Achroina, and the latter Hey. That's the Malchut element. The Malchut element is the element of the divine, which is completely engaging with the world. Because Malchut is generally associated with speech. So when are you really connecting with someone else? If you're emotionally caught up with someone, there is a bond. But you're still in your own world. You can be very, very emotionally charged about another person, but until you open a conversation, there's still distance. But when you talk to that person, you're actually communicating, and communication means you're entering into their space. You're projecting your whatever you're extending yourself into that they can hear your words, take it in, and so it's a full interaction. So you can see how God is descending from his infinite, unknowable self. He begins with a point, which is Chochmah, expands that into a Hey, which is the Bina, the understanding, a more comprehensible intelligence. From there, it descends the 6 emotions, where God is becoming more vulnerable or accessible to the creation and closer to the creation. Finally, God speaks to the world, opens up a mouth, or emanates of himself a mouth through which he can speak and communicate with the world. And that's how he creates the actual creations. So now we can understand the name of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei. It contains within itself the entire descent of God in his descent from being utterly to himself to being into a relationship with creation and with the world. That's the significance of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Okay. Now we discussed the 4 letters. But when you look at a Yud, you realize that the Yud has got something more than just the point. The Yud, on the top of the Yud, has got a little thorn. If you look at the letter Yud, you see that on the top it has a little crown going upward. That crown is indicative of something above Chochmah. So the Yud is alerting us that it doesn't start with the point. The Yud is telling us that something precedes the point. But what precedes the arrow with that chimney of the Yud is pointing to is invisible. It's not on the parchment. It's not on the paper. Why? Because that's indicative to a level that's still completely and utterly undefined. Because it's above definition, because it's the stage of still pure infinity. And that's called Keter, the crown. The crown is above the head, above the Chochmah. V'hinei kutzoi shel Yud, the thorn on top of the Yud, anibchenes Kesser, which is the crown, shememenu nimtzeis Chochmah, which is from the crown, is where the Chochmah comes in. Where did that first initial spark of the divine that sparks all of existence, where is that coming from? Or what we might say in the terms of Chochmah is the germ of the idea. Like an idea germinated. That idea, where does that come from? From an unknowable producer of intelligence. It's the source of the creativity, of the creative mind, but it's still unknown to us. That's called not sechel, which is intellect, maskil, the place that produces intelligence, but because it's such a primordial state, we don't know it. It's so hidden. That's the Kesser, the crown. Now, like it says in the verse, that the wisdom emerges from nothingness. Simply it means from where does wisdom come from? But we all know that when we are scratching our head because we're up against a certain when we're trying to figure out, when we're caught in a situation in which we need to figure out how to resolve it, whether it's a scientific query, whether it is just a dilemma in your own life and you don't know how to proceed, you're trying to figure something out, so you're in a state of, I don't know, you're up, and then suddenly, from nowhere, an idea flashes in your mind. Now, that place where it came from, we don't know where that is. We ask, Maayon, from where? It fell from nowhere. Like you say, like out of nowhere, this thought fell into my head. But that nowhere is somewhere. It's just unknown to us. Kesser is that mystery. Kesser is that unknown place above Chochmah. Chochmah comes from ayin, from nothingness. Kidu, as it is known. So Chochmah, we can't really call Chochmah ayin, because Chochmah is already the beginning of some things, because it's already a point, even though the point doesn't have any design, but it's still already a point. So it's already yesh, it's something. Keter is the real ayin. Crown is the real nothingness, Ein Sof. If you do, it is known, Chochmah shenimtzas min ayin, the Kesser nikra Eden. So it is known that the Chochmah that is the first production coming from the pure nothingness of Keter. So the Chochmah is called Eden, which is the source of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Now, if the Garden of Eden is the place that is the destination from where all pleasure comes from, Garden of Eden is the ultimate experience of pleasure. If it's the Garden of Eden, so Eden must be like super, super, super pleasurable. But here we're saying that the Chochmah is called Eden. Bina is called the Garden of Eden. Bina is the garden. Or rather, like explained in other places, Bina is the river that flows from Eden and flows into the garden. The garden is actually lower. The garden is Malchut, like we said earlier, Chakal Tapuch and Kadishan, the tree orchard. That's where the garden is. But the garden has to be irrigated, and the waters that irrigate it, which is the water is the source of pleasure that brings the pleasure into the garden, make everything grow. Where does the water come from? The water is the Bina. Where does it come from? It comes from the mysterious level called Eden, which is the Chochmah, which is still a state that is so unknown because it's just a point. And the pleasure on that point is so potent and so powerful, but so beyond definition. And because it's so beyond definition, it remains hidden. It's a very hidden pleasure. It's a what we might call what would be the right word for a hidden? No, my head is not working now. I'm falling asleep. An elusive pleasure, in Bina, once it hits the river, it starts to becoming a tangible pleasure. Before that, it's up here. But then there is even higher than that Eden. What's producing the Eden? Eden is like the spring, but where's the spring coming from? Spring is coming from ayin, from complete nothingness, which is the pre-pleasure of Eden. So each level we're going back is so much more potent and powerful than and less limited than the forthcoming levels. Again, the Yidua is known. The Kesser, that the Chochmah that comes from the ayin, the nothingness of Kesser, Nikra Eden, that's called Eden. Now, why is Chochmah called Eden? Because Eden represents pleasure. But the pleasure of Eden, because in wisdom, there is pleasure. As we all know, that when a person conceives an idea, especially when you're creative and you brainstorm an idea, it's one of the greatest pleasures in life. When a person comes up with like, I have this thought. It's tremendous pleasure. Like we see in the literal sense. When a person has a haskala means when a person has a new seichel, an epiphany. The yamtzi is a seichel chadash, and he brings forth in his mind some kind of a new concept. From the power of wisdom that suddenly produced an original idea. Where the person experiences great delight at that moment. And the person becomes excited, b'tainog, in pleasure, and there's like this very, very great excitement. People love sharing a chiddush of theirs. If you watch, I know this YouTube channel called Rabbi Reuven Wolf at Maayon. So you watch the rabbi teach over there sometimes, Monday classes, especially if it's his own thoughts. He goes like on fire with like ecstasy and pleasure from these. Because there's like this excitement when you innovate something, you have like this deep pleasure. And you're like living in this pleasure, especially when it's like, especially if in the middle of a class, this like something like a deeper epiphany comes forth. It's pure ecstasy and bliss. So that's the fire of it. But he asks a question. Intellect is a different substance than pleasure. Intellect is intellect. Pleasure is pleasure. These are two different experiences, two different substances. Why is it that when you have an insight, what does the insight, what does the intellectual idea have to do with pleasure? So he's going to explain it over here. And at first glance, the seichel and the pleasure doesn't have any attachment and doesn't have any connection at all. The substance of intellect is separated from the substance of pleasure. They're two different things. How do you know that? Because if you would say that intelligence is pleasurable, that part of the makeup of intelligence is pleasure, if that would be the case, then pleasure would belong to what? To intelligence. But we see, he says, that pleasure is not relegated only to intelligence. You can do a beautiful hike and be filled with pleasure from the hike that you're taking and from the beautiful vista that you're looking at. You can listen to music and be filled with pleasure from the music. You can eat food and be delighted from the pleasure of the food. And so on and so forth, so many other different types of pleasures that there are. So what do we see? That pleasure is not intelligence. Pleasure is a experience. What exactly pleasure is? It's a feeling that feels very, very good. It's like, you can't explain it other than knowing, because we all know what pleasure is. It's just a feeling of pleasure. So what are we seeing from here? It accompanies the intellect, but it's not the intellect. Somehow, or we might say, it's vested in the intellect, but it's not the intellect. It's vested in an idea, especially an original idea that comes to a person. The pleasure is vested in it, but it's not it. And that very pleasure vests itself also in other channels. It's other avenues. So we're going to see the pleasure is really the water of the soul. And the water can mix in different things. Some of that water of the soul mixes into the intellect. A great lot of water. That's why intellectual study and engagement is one of the highest forms of pleasures that there is. But the water of the soul also vests itself in visuals. When you see something magnificently beautiful, it gives you pleasure. Or hearing it vests itself also in sound and in the experience of sound. It vests itself in art and other artistic expression, and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing over here is that the pleasure and the intellect are not the same. The pleasure can be and other things. Like doing a tiul. What's a tiul? Going on a trip, whatever that trip is. Or eating. Which are very much not an intellectual experience. No. What we see from here, there is a certain extract of the soul. This extract of the soul is called pleasure. And this soul extract is present in multi experiences of the various different experiences of human life. The pleasure seeps into it. The pleasure is integrated in it. The taino comes into that intellect in the concept, in this idea that the person has produced, this new concept, this new rich idea, this new chidush that you said, this novel idea. Inside of it is just like you pour a little salt into eggs, and you can put salt into mashed potatoes. You can put salt into chicken soup. So the pleasure goes into the intellect. It becomes enclosed and it dwells in it. But it's not that the Chochmah is one essence with the pleasure. And he gives a very special proof to that. Who receives the greatest pleasure of an idea? Who's like experiencing like literally on a high? It's the person who this idea is his thought. Now, people that are listening, if it's a really beautiful thought, the people that are listening also receive pleasure. And sometimes, if it's a very powerful thought, the people listening can get a lot of pleasure. But it still can't compare to the person who innovated it. That person who innovated, like they're on a high for days, because it enamors them and it elevates them into such a high place all the time. They can't forget their pleasure that they had the moment. Now, if the idea itself, the substance, the concept itself is pleasure, in other words, we would say that in every concept there is the concept and the pleasure is part of it, then what difference does it make if so-and-so was the one who introduced the idea, who innovated the idea? But once they have the idea and the idea is one with the pleasure, once they share it to someone else, as long as you understand, the other person understands that they should have the same measure of pleasure. The fact that the other person, the recipient, does not even, they have 30% of the pleasure that the person who innovated has, is a sign that it's not the pure, just, plain, concept itself that is of the pleasure, but that there is pleasure invested in a concept. And by who is it invested the most? By the person who originated that idea. That's the idea he's explaining. The proof to this is as follows. If the pleasure would be in the essence of the wisdom of the concept Why do we see they will not have this delight in the hispailos and the excitement of pleasure? Only the person who innovated the new idea. But if someone else who listens to, who gets it from him, and receives this new idea, does not get that excited about it. They have pleasure, but you can't compare it to the originator of the idea. The imoy says but if the excitement of the pleasure rak mitzada seichel atzmoi would be part and parcel of the intellect itself. In other words, that we would say intelligence is pleasurable. So if whenever you're chewing on a new idea, just by chewing on it in your mind, it's like chewing gum is flavorable. A concept that you're chewing on your mind releases the pleasure that's in it and you feel pleasure. Then everybody should be equal. The person who innovated and everybody else, because it's the flavor of the gum itself. It's the flavor of the concept itself. The flavor is the delight that's part of it. But the listener is also hearing it. Sometimes a person listening to someone else understands the idea even better than the teacher. It's possible. Sometimes you have, someone is very creative, but other people that have deeper understanding can take that very creative idea and actually have a richer understanding in that idea. Yet they don't have the same level of pleasure. So why is that? It should be equal to the situation where they themselves innovated this idea. And even though we see that the listener also gets excited and experiences pleasure, but this type of excitement that the listener gets, if it's not your idea, doesn't have any comparison at all to the excitement of pleasure that the influencer has, the guy who came up with the idea. It's just not comparable. So we have to say Chochmah, that the pleasure is not of one substance with the Chochmah itself, but rather the pleasure is coming from something in the soul that's above the intelligence, and when the intelligence is produced, a droplet of pleasure drops into it. A droplet of something deeper in the soul, of the inner delight of the soul, drops into the pleasure and drops into the concept. And when you're experiencing the concept, along with that comes an infusion of soul substance, which is the pleasure. And that's the reason why the person who innovated it, and therefore meaning was the one who opened it up from its source, is pulling at the soul itself, at that ocean of pleasure, subconscious pleasure, a superconscious pleasure that's above our conscious experience, and allows that to manifest and come forth. And therefore it does not enclose itself and does not arrive. It reveals itself mostly to the excavator, the one who excavated this concept and this idea from the vast potential of ideas, the one who pulled this concept out from let's say in Torah, the one who innovates a concept in Torah. It was always there, but it was hidden and lost in the Torah. So someone pulled this concept out. That person gets like an infusion, not just the idea, but they get an infusion of the pleasure behind that's above the concept, that comes along for the ride, goes into the consciousness together with the concept that has now been delivered. And really, what is that? The real pleasure, the essential pleasure is what? Shmuel Chaim. The essential pleasure is really what? Is not the Chochmah. The pleasure is really Kesser, the crown. The nothingness, the world of pleasure is the nothingness of the soul. Meaning the pre-definitions of the soul, the pure, raw, simple, undefined energy of the spirit itself, without any definitions. That's the pleasure, and that's called nothingness. And but when you're pulling a something from a nothing, some of that nothing comes along with it, and that's the pleasure you're feeling. When you're giving over the idea to someone else, the other person is already only interacting with the something of the idea. They're not interacting so much with the pre-idea because they didn't produce it. So they're not interacting with the nothingness. They're only interacting with the something of the idea. And the something of the idea that's not where the pleasure is. The pleasure is in the nothing that's surrounding the something. Gewalt. That was pleasurable. Which is the essence of the pleasure that's in the soul. Because the root from where new seichel, where new ideas are the source of it, is coming from above the intellect. The intellect is already a production of something, of the pre-intelligence, which is the pure power, creative ability of the soul, the nothingness of the soul. And that nothingness, that's the substance of the pleasure. Kesser, which is the level of the keter, the crown, shenikra atika, that is called the ancient one. Atika kadisha, the ancient one. Ki as it is known. And therefore, the one that innovates the new idea, since he's the one who's transporting it from the source of the intellect, which is the pleasure itself, this person is digging in the pre-consciousness. As they are digging and digging, here's the thing, while you're digging, it's not pleasurable. Because you have nothing in your head, you're just in the dark, and sometimes even frustrating. But once you manage and pushing and getting frustrated, and then suddenly, boom, like you manage to shovel something out, you're able to stick that shovel in and pull something forth, and that comes forth. Whoa. There's like an opening to the preconscious soul, to the place from where the idea is falling from, and that's that source. That's all that we can say. And that's why this person, the one who did that, has the greatest excitement from that new concept. Because along with the delivery of the idea comes the one who's producing the idea, and that is the predefined soul, which is the keter, which is the pleasure. So really what that means, that in the background of each and every one of our consciousness lies an ocean of pleasure. And the reason we're just not conscious of it, because it's too lofty, too high, too undefined. It's only when that pleasure finds something to like dress itself in, we can feel it. Where does it dress itself in? One of its primary vessels and containers where it can enclose itself, or garments, is when from its creative, when it produces a concept, when it produces an idea, it jumps into some of that undefined pleasure, leaks into, so to speak, that new vessel, that new concept, and that's the delight. Because above, it's the source for its existence of this new idea, which would not be the case to this other person. A person who has not been excavating the idea from the Kesser. So even if that person experiences a little pleasure, it cannot be compared to the producer himself. V'dar l'meivin, it is enough to those who understand. And we will understand, therefore, this would be applied above as well. In the Chochmah of the world of Atzilus, in God's wisdom, there's also two levels. One is the Chochmah of Atzilus once it is already established. That means God's manifest intelligence. Imagine God's intelligence. It's got the super intelligence of the cosmos, of the entire cosmic order, everything. It's the super intelligence, but it's already a manifest concept. The concepts of all concepts, but it's a concept already. It's already a revealed entity. But then there is the higher level of Chochmah, where the divine mind is pulling from the infinite divine potential, the Ein Sof of God, where there is a never-ending flow of new concept and new idea, which can recreate, so to speak, the mind of Atzilus, the mind of God, in infinite, with infinite possibilities. That's a much higher level of Chochmah. That's the Chochmah as it is still connected to Keter. Chochmah Me'ayin. Wow, that place is where the pleasure is happening. That's where the fireworks are going on. On pleasure that is, right? So let's see. There is Chochmah. There is Hashem's Chochmah that does not have so much the radiance of the supernal pleasure. It's pure intelligence, not intelligence with pleasure. Now, doesn't mean there's no, because always in every intelligence there is some, especially in rich intelligence. So if you know something and understand something well, there is a kernel of pleasure there all the time. But he says, that's a little bit, but tzimtzum gadol, very contracted. V'ayud the shem Havayah. That's the yud. The yud of the name Havayah, because yud is already the fixed Chochmah. It's the point. It's already what has dropped in from the pre-undefined God infinity of Hashem to already a point of divine wisdom. So there is pleasure there in the yud, but of course, when we say there's pleasure there's more pleasure there than we can ever begin to whatever, not just fathom. It's like, but compared to where the pleasure is really happening, it's considered insignificant. He says it is the example. The yud is like the example of someone else hearing a concept. He also has pleasure, but that person is not connected. The listener, as we said before, the recipient is not connected to the excavation process, so they're not touching the pre-intellect. So in the person itself, the place where your conceived ideas are already stored, it's already there. It's like that's like already a recipient, and therefore it's minimal. Because he did not draw it from the source. Or I'll give you another example. He doesn't say it here, but he gave the example in another place. Even the innovator of the idea, if time goes by and they forget about it, and then someone reminds them, oh, you remember your class you gave on so-and-so? And you say, yeah, it was a good class. Yeah, I remember. But you're not filled with that delight and that pleasure. Even if you remember, and even if you think over the idea, it's just not. Why? Because it's only when you've been recently, you opened up the window to the sun, the sun of your neshama, the light of the, and you're basking in that light. That's the pleasure. That's when you're filled with it. And maybe it can last as long as the idea is still fresh in your head, like a day or 2 days or a week or so, depending on how many times you're repeating it again and again, so you're refreshing it. But if you forget about it for a long time, even if you remember the concept, you still don't have that pleasure. Why? Because that's the yud of the Chochmah. But then, where is the real party happening? Where is the real pleasure happening? In the in the part of the Yud that's indicating above. So it's Chochmah still, but Chochmah that is knocking on the door the entire time to the pre-Chochmah, which is the Kesser, to bring new idea. That's where the real pleasure is. Because on that level is where you're excavating. The Abeis and the second one, the deeper level of Chochmah that's called Eden. Because in this Chochmah, it is illuminating from the supernal pleasure, Hanikra Atika, that's called Atika, the ancient one. And this would be compared to the person who has innovated the idea. He gets excitement with a pleasure that's beyond. Because he's the one pulling it from the source of the idea. And that is that thorn on top of the yud. That's the point where Kesser and Chochmah are interacting with each other. The point of innovation. Not a sterile idea, but an idea that's just being produced it's in the manufacturing plant. It's just being produced from nothing. That's called the Eden. That's where Kesser and Chochmah are connecting. The Maven, and it is enough to those who understand. V'hinei b'Shabbos mizgal b'chinas oinege elyon da'atika b'Chochmah da'atzilus. The difference between weekday and Shabbos is in the weekday, although there is an entire system of Sefirot, Chochmah, Bina, and so forth, and there is pleasure in Chochmah, and of course from the pleasure of Chochmah there is pleasure in Bina, and so on and so forth, but it's more like a sterile type of a state. Things have already been downloaded, things are already fixed, and this is the idea for creation. Shabbos is like the day of innovation. Shabbos is when the Chochmah rises and taps the Kesser and new ideas are flowing, and suddenly it's like brilliant light flowing and the opening of the soul of Chochmah to the Ein Sof, to the Kesser. And that's why Shabbos in general is called Aliyas HaOlamos. All worlds rise. What does it mean? The Chochmah is rising into Kesser. And because of that, the Chochmah is in a state of unimaginable cosmic pleasure on a level of Ein Sof. And that's why, and that trickles down into the entire cosmic order. That on every level, existence becomes filled with delight and pleasure. What an amazing understanding of Shabbos. Your pleasure of Atik Yomin reveals itself in Chochmah Datzilus. And therefore, we know the day that all souls are invited to the great Shabbos party, to a place of unimaginable delight. Souls in the upper world, souls in the afterlife, are always in a place of delight. When? Mainly on Shabbos. Shabbos is the ultimate day of when souls go up in Gan Eden and go to a place of the time of the elevation of souls in Gan Eden, who b'Shabbos dafka is on Shabbos. Because that's when there's news. That's where there's a new maamar. There's a new download. There's a new flow. Like it says, it says it will be on every Rosh Chodesh, umidei Shabbos b'Shabbatoi, and on every Shabbos, Yavai kol basar leishtachveis lefanai. Every person will come, all flesh will come to bow down before me. And the Zohar says this is referring to the souls of Gan Eden. They're called flesh, even though they're high, lofty souls. And they come to bow in front of God, which means to become nullified in the new divine, powerful, potent illuminations that are shining and are revealing itself on Shabbos that were not revealed during the week. And like it's explained in the book Sefer HaBoyer, which is a special book that is attributed to the great sage Rebbe Nechunya ben Akana, who was a great Kabbalist. From the sages of the Mishnah, he was known to be a giant in mysticism. So in his Sefer, called Sefer Abar, he says over there like this, Sheyesh amud began eden atachton. There is an elevator, there is a pillar. In the lower Gan Eden, a pillar, and through this pillar, you enter inside the pillar, and it serves like an elevator, and you rise from the lower Gan Eden to the higher Gan Eden. When do the souls enter that pillar? On Shabbos. And they rise up to much higher levels. Gan Eden Shabbat on the nishmas, which on it the souls go up, the Gan Eden Elyon to the supernal Gan Eden. And when does this happen? Every Shabbos. Midday Shabbos b'Shabbatoi, every single Shabbos. And you know, and the idea is Kibchenes HaChochmah Nikra Eden b'Shabbos dafka. And the reason for that is because Chochmah itself, which is the source of the experience of all intelligence and all delight and all bina. Because what's Gan Eden all about? There is a great understanding of godliness. Bina, the river, flows into the garden to water the garden and give all kinds of delights of understanding. But it's all coming from Chochmah. Now, Chochmah during the week is a little stagnant. On Shabbos, Chochmah suddenly is like going haywire with creativity. Because Chochmah is now entering into Kesser. Chochmah is called Eden only on Shabbos. In the weekday, Chochmah is a once upon Eden, but it's not an Eden. The Eden experience happens on Shabbos. Like it says, V'karrasa l'Shabbos oineg. The verse says you should call to Shabbos pleasure. Karrasa l'Shabbos oineg. You should call to Shabbos pleasure. It is. So when you read about Lubavitch, it's very interesting. You read about the Bachrim back in Rostov and Lubavitch, the Chassidic boys. They had Shabbos. That was the Shabbos. There was not much. They used to have, of course, some basic Shabbos foods, but there was not much really to make much of a. There wasn't a gourmet meal there in Lubavitch, I promise you. There was a little. And no one even got to the meal because the Rebbe Rashab would say a maamar at Friday night, and everybody would be like glued to the maamar. And then the Bachrim would stay right away, and they would review it, and barely at 3 a.m, they would go eat the meal, and their heads were not even. And you wonder, like pathetic boys, they don't have a Shabbos meal. Look at this. Yeah, well, Moroccan fish and this and matzo balls and whatever and meat and beef and chicken and kugels and whatever. And they don't have that in the Nebuch. What do they realize? It's like they looked at us like we're totally pathetic. Are you crazy? This is Shabbos pleasure. I mean, Shabbos pleasure has to be in everything, even in the food. True. But you realize it's the light in the new innovation and the new light and the new maamar. That's where it's coming. That's where the new illuminate. That's where the powerful, incredible soul pleasure is taking place. For those who are able to tune into that. Pirish Shabbos, v'kras l'Shabbos oineg. What does it mean? Pirish Shabbos u'pchines moichen da'aba keyadua. Shabbos is the time when Chochmah is open to us. But it's not just Chochmah. It's Chochmah as Chochmah is in a state of innovation. And the supernal pleasure of Atik Yomin, Nimshach b'Chochmah, is drawn into Chochmah, K'niskalel, like we said earlier. And therefore, Abina Nikra Memela Gan Eden. And that's the reason why, since Chochmah on Shabbos is called Eden, and since Bina receives from Chochmah, so Bina is called Gan Eden. Earlier we said that Bina is called the river that goes out of Eden. But Bina itself is also called Gan Eden. 22, so he brings from the Zohar and from many places. Because Bina receives from Chochmah. And they're called two friends that never separate. There is a difference between Chochmah and Bina. Chochmah, as we said earlier, is still a very closed state, because Chochmah is still an energy that's everything is just in a pure point, in a concentrated point. So, and it's above understanding, so it's still too potent for understanding. So even though there's immense pleasure there, but the pleasure is still in a state of not so revealed. It's happening on a deep inner space in the soul, in the recesses of the soul. But then when it goes into Bina, which is full-fledged understanding, it's emerging more outward. Just like the concept itself is going more to the outside, more to a graspable state. In the same way, the pleasure that's hidden in the idea is also becoming more revealed. But it doesn't mean more pleasurable. It just means more conscious of the pleasure, more revealed into the experience of the person. And that's why it will be more visible in the external side of the person. The person will physically be more reacting to that pleasure. As opposed to the Chochmah, they're silent because the pleasure is taking place very deep inside. So the external human being is less part of that experience. The pleasure is still concealed. The concealment of Chochmah. But in Bina, the pleasure comes down into a state of revelation. Just like Bina in general, that Bina expands to the length and to the width. Like the letter Hey. That's why the revelation of pleasure, the revelation of the Ancient of Days, which is the secret pleasure of the Ein Sof, where is it revealed? That's why there's a famous statement of in Kabbalah, his galus atik bebina. The revelation of Atik Yom and of the Ancient of Days is in Bina. It's the revelation of it that is more revealed, but not in Chochmah. It's far more intense, but less revealed. Not a Chochmah. Is explained elsewhere. Bina gan Eden. What's more pleasurable, gan or Eden? So in terms of an external form of an experience, gan is far more pleasurable because there you can eat the fruits, you can enjoy. The Eden itself is the spring that's going to make all these fruit grow. So it's a very pleasurable spring, but it's but it's still too lofty, and it's not that experienceable yet. Because in the Bina, the Chochmah is revealing itself. The Eden is finding expression in the garden, including the strawberries, the apples, the mangoes, and everything else that's being grown from it. But the real essence of it is in the Eden, is in the Chochmah, which in the Chochmah lies the ayin, the nothingness of Kesser, which is the essence of the pleasure. The Lasham Olam HaNeshamas b'Shabbos, and that's where the souls are going up on Shabbos. The Maila Shabbat Dafka. When do they go up there? Friday night. Friday night is the journey from wherever the souls are in Gan Eden. They hop onto this pillar, they go onto the elevator, and up they go. They rise into the supernal Gan Eden and go even deeper. They reach all the way up into the Eden itself. As explained in Zohar in many places. So now he says, even though this is so beautiful and so phenomenal and so intense and so incredibly ecstasy and bliss, however, the light of Kesser that shines into Chochmah, get ready for the next piece. The next piece is the light of Chochmah the light of Keter that shines into Chochmah is only a very minimal strip of Kesser. The essence of Kesser cannot reveal itself in Chochmah. And that remains in the pure ocean of pleasure that's beyond all consciousness. That does not reveal itself in any epiphany, in any light, it's the pleasure of the essence of the soul. Friday night, we don't access that. Friday night, we access the pleasure that encloses itself where? In Chochmah. Shabbos day, we rise deeper than the emanation of pleasure of Kesser that goes into Chochmah, but we rise, everything returns and is elevated all the way up into the essence of the ayin of the nothingness. It's pre-epiphany. You go all the way up into and you're conscious. You can become conscious of that infinite pleasure. That's the idea. What's that experience? He's going to associate that with, let me give you the short synopsis of where he's going to take this. When a person produces something, let's say an artist who's going to draw a painting. So while they're painting, they're preoccupied in their painting. It's not really so pleasurable. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of fixing, and a lot of this and a lot of that. It's work. It's not so much pleasure. As the painting gets completed, there's like, they get like, wow. And suddenly they become filled with this overwhelming sense of like pleasure and delight. They take such pleasure in what they produced, in the painting they produced, or the craftsman, the smith, or a woodworker, or someone who builds a car, or whatever it is, or you're writing a paper. You had an idea. While you're doing it, you're actually in agony a lot of times because the words are not coming to you. You're experiencing brain freeze. You're whatever. But then finally, when you get it done, and you do edits, and now it's finished, and it's delightful. And he says something very interesting. It's only delightful if it came out the way you intended it from the original. In other words, if in the end you end up with a different product that you weren't even like, this is not what you wanted to produce, and everybody looks and says, it's pretty good. It's very good. And you say, no, it's not what I had in mind. Scrap, you take the paper, you scrunch it up, you throw it out. You worked on it for 2 weeks. Nah. It's not satisfying. It has to match up. Like, now it's interesting. You don't always know exactly, but you know if it's not matching. In other words, what you initially thought could be very subconscious. But if in the end if it's not matching that hidden whatever, you don't have pleasure. When it ends up being like to satisfaction, which means, this is what I wanted the whole time. It came out like, that's it. And only the person is sensitive to that. Other people can tell them the word, it's good. You see how you ever have that with people sometimes? I produced this, and it's so nice, it's so good. Your wife tries to tell you, it's so nice, the shiur came out really good. He says, no, but I know it's just not it. I have that all the time. My wife tries to, she said, Tzaddik is my wife. She tells me, it was so good. And I say, after the Kiddush, I go home Shabbos, I say, I spoke, but I didn't capture it. I didn't. I know what came out was not, when earlier in the shul, when I was like brainstorming it and I had it like there, I knew what I wanted, and then it did not result. And she says, come on, it's good. It was really good. Everybody enjoyed it. Ariella enjoyed it tremendously. This one, she always tells me that. Everyone enjoyed it. The ladies were so happy. Everybody loved what you said. I said, the ladies were happy? That makes me very happy. But you should know that the inner pleasure is only if it comes. The inner pleasure only is only there if the final product is what you wanted. That's when the pleasure is there. But watch this. Why is that? Because when you have a desire for something, the desire has a pleasure inside of it. There's something pleasurable in your soul. In other words, your undefined pleasure spit out a crumb of pleasure, and that pleasure is the kernel for this desire that you want to see. And therefore, if the end result does not match that kernel of pleasure, it could be nice, but if it's not matching the kernel of pleasure, which is the engine of the whole thing, it's not it. So you can, again, as an artist, and anybody who deals with anything creative will tell you that this is the way it is. but he's giving you actually the gewaldige science behind it. What motivated you to begin with is that something in your pre-consciousness saw something, had a pleasure in whatever, and wants that drives the whole thing. And hopefully you're able to like guide your talents to match that thing. And if it comes out like that, then it's okay. And when the final product matches it, that's when the pleasure reveals itself. Which pleasure? The pleasure that sparked the whole thing. While you're in the midst of the work, the pleasure remains hidden. But when you finish the work, that's when it comes out accordance to consistent with it, that's when the pleasure is revealed. But watch this. This is all introduction to the next thought. This is so good. That's stage number one. But then there's even a deeper pleasure. You step away, you finished it, and you're like 3 feet away, and you're looking. You're done. You're done. You've been working on this project for weeks. You close your eyes, and you just like relax, and you're like, and then you open your eyes again and look at that from a distance. Now the pleasure is way more than even the minute you concluded it. It's like, wow. Why? Because that crumb of pleasure that was the inspiration of the entire project and the drive of what you were doing is still only a crumb of your pleasure. That crumb reveals itself when you completed the project and the project is consistent with that crumb of pleasure, with that emanation of pleasure, it works. 10 minutes later, after you stopped, you're done, you're going to take vacation now for a week because you need to rest your mind. What you basically is happening, you're allowing all the powers of your soul to go back into their source. The pleasure, this satisfied pleasure, rises back up into the pool of infinite pleasure. And that pleasure is already off the charts. It's very subtle, it's very hidden, it's a very high level. But in terms of the depth of it is incomparable to the particular pleasure. Because here you're getting back into the pleasure just of self, the pleasure of beingness, which is much higher than the pleasure of what you produced. But that you only arrive to after you fulfilled a particular pleasure, then you rebound back into the source from where all pleasure comes from, and can experience a little vibration of that place. And that's this very, very deep satisfaction. That's the pleasure of Shabbos day, much higher than Friday night. Friday night is God sees the world at the end of the week that fits exactly his plan. And he goes, wow. This was great. Great investment. Every Friday night, there's so much good that happens in the world during the week. From all the mitzvot and davening and learning and all that the world is moved and all the kindness, and the pleasure is immense to God. But it's the pleasure of the project. And when the world matches what God intends it to match, there is pleasure. Shabbos day, Hashem has already moved farther. It's no more the immediate effect of it. It's like the person 10 minutes later. He's already back. Hashem has rested and relaxed back completely into himself. He returns and he brings the particular pleasure into the undefined pleasure. The pleasure of just beingness, the pleasure of God's beingness. And that's called pure Kesser. Not the ray of Kesser that goes into Chochmah, but the Kesser as Kesser stands for itself. And that's the Shabbos day meal, much higher than the Friday night. That's what he's going to lay out over here. And that's why Shabbos day we say, Dohu Sudasa Datika Kadisha. This is the meal of Atik. This is the pleasure. Meal is pleasure. This is the meal of Atika Kadisha. This is when the Ancient of Days himself, Friday night is the pleasure of the project. Shabbos day is the pleasure of Kesser itself as it is in its own place. Gewalt, that we can go along with all of this and be part of that. So this is what he's explaining. So even the ray of pleasure that encloses itself in Chochmah is only a ray from the essential power of pleasure. It doesn't have any comparison at all with the essence of the power of pleasure as it is to itself. Like we see in the literal when a person gets excited by some type of a pleasure, that becomes enclosed in something, if it's a new creative idea, or if it's in a trip that you take, a beautiful walk you took, a hike, whatever, a boat ride, whatever it is that you're doing, horseback riding, whatever you're doing, any kind of what we call a tiul, all the tzir no, or a beautiful piece of art. So this pleasure that is drawn from the essence of the power of pleasure that's in one's soul, it's only a ray of your power of pleasure. It's drawn forth, but it's not the essence of it. Because the essence of the power of pleasure that's in one's soul has the power to manifest in many things. And it can change from one form of pleasure to the other form of pleasure. Here you're listening to music, here your pleasure in oratory element, here the pleasure is in music or in dancing or whatever. It's not to receive pleasure from that which person doesn't and you can change your pleasure, and from something that you don't desire, you don't have pleasure. The nimtza comes out and comes out that pleasure that arrives and encloses itself in that particular thing, by like an intelligence, is only a ray, and a small little ray, that is coming out from the pool, from the greater pool of the great source of pleasure in the soul. Because the pleasure in potential is a very abstract power which includes everything that will come from it. It includes within it every power of giloy, of revelation, that will come from it in pleasure. Stated elsewhere. So therefore it is a must. And that's the reason, now it comes to the next stage. Since this pleasure is only a ray from the essential pleasure, it too needs to be retracted into its source to replenish. Which means everything, just like a person gets tired, everything has to go back to replenishment. So the particularized pleasures, the pleasure in vision, the pleasure in music, the pleasure in art, the pleasure in intellect, all these pleasures, since they're not the essence of the pleasure, they're only rays of pleasure, they need to go back into their source. And that's what happens when a person rests. And everything goes back into their source. And Shabbos is a time of resting. Pulling out of everything you've invested yourself in, which are pleasurable, but they're only rays of pleasure, and allowing everything to go back into the undefined source where the essence of pleasure takes place. But it's usually too subtle not to feel it. The only time we feel it is when we are relaxing from a revealed pleasure. Then we can still feel pleasure, but the feeling that we're feeling is the broad pleasure, not the narrow pleasure anymore. The narrow pleasure kind of, as it goes back into its source, creates ripples and vibrations in the undefined, usually pre-conscious pleasure, so that we can feel those vibrations. And that's like this, that's that higher essential pleasure. And it becomes absorbed in the essence of the pleasure. That's called the source of all pleasures. And that only happens on Shabbos. Like it says, and we're going to see later, in the day of Shabbos, not the night of Shabbos. As it says, that the heavens and the earth were completed. And all their hosts. And it says, God concluded on the seventh day. And Pirish Vayachulu, Vayachal, what does it mean, Vayachulu? They ended and were completed. But it doesn't only mean God finished his work. It means that the powers that God invested in creation expire. When we say they expire, it means they go back from being invested into pre-investment. So they expire into their source. So everything is being pulled back into to its source from where it comes from. That's the meaning of the word Shabbos. Shabbos means to return. Returning to self. Returning to pre-definition. Replenishing yourself in your essence. Isn't that awesome, Shabbos? You're replenishing. You're replenishing all your projections into your essence. And you're not making it up because all of existence is doing it together with you. You're just joining in this replenishment. Every single soul is replenishing itself in its own essence. And that's included in the entire world that is replenishing itself in its source, and that's included in the cosmos that are replenishing itself in its source, and that's included in the divine infinite light that's replenishing itself in its source. So everything is in that one state of return into its source. Like kol sanafshi, my soul is expiring. The soul that is being expired, and this comes like the soul going out from the deepest delight. So included in this elevation of every power is the pleasure that has, in other words, the power of vision, this power of God, that power of God, God's creativity in making heaven and earth, God's wisdom. All these things go back to their source. But you know what else goes back to the source? The rays of pleasure that accompanied everything and is like this undercurrent in every experience also returns into the ocean of pleasure from where it all comes from. The pleasure that is enclosed in all the work of creation. The root of all of them is Chochmah, and yet, where does it go up? Into the essence of the pleasure. Everything expires. The heavens expire. It becomes expired and absorbed in the supernal, in the essence of the supernal pleasure, that is still within the essence of the emanator. The emanations get reabsorbed in the emanator before it comes to a state of revelation. Which is way above, a lot. Way more than the Eden experience that we spoke about earlier, where there is a ray of pleasure that goes into the Chochmah. In other words, the thrill you have when you have an epiphany is only a ray, is only a projection. And here, everything is returning to the essence. And it is enough to those who understand. Now we'll understand the verse that we opened up with. Gewalt. We say about Shabbos, Az tisaneg, then you will delight al Havayah, on top of Havayah. Because the pleasure of Havayah, remember we said, the Yud has a little bit of pleasure. The thorn on top of the Yud, that's where the main pleasure takes place, because that's where Kesser, Chochmah Maayon timatze, Chochmah, the point of innovation, where the creative mind is creating new ideas and pulling from this nothingness, the pre-intelligence as that's emerging outwards. Whoa, that's so pleasurable. But all of that, it can't, that's Havayah. Shabbos is much deeper than that. Az tisaneg, then you will delight al Havayah, because you're going back to the pleasure pre-emanating, the pleasure in its quintessential source. Pirish al lamayla m'shem Havayah, above from the name of the tetragrammaton. The shem Havayah b'dalad oisiyos, the name Havayah and its four letters, Chochmah bina, which is the Chochmah and the Bina and the Midos and the emotions, Malchus and Malchus, like we said earlier. The Kutzei Shel Yud, and the point that's on top of the Yud, Kesser Chochmah Kanal, is the radiance of Kesser that's in Chochmah. Avo b'Shabbos, but on Shabbos, yashaliyah lebchenas ha'aras ha'onei de Kesser. On Shabbos, there is an elevation to the radiance of pleasure that's in Kesser. Shem elubish b'Chochmah, the ray of Kesser that's enclosed in Chochmah, it too rises back up in its source. Ba'atzmos ha'tainug, in the essence of the pleasure, like we said earlier. And that's why he says, "Az tisaneg." Then you will delight al Havayah, on Havayah, l'mayla gam mepchenes kutze shel yud, above even the thorn of the yud, shem Havayah d'Atzilus, which is in the name of Havayah of Atzilus. Lefisha az mizgala mepchenas atzmos ha'taineg elyon. Because then what is being revealed is the essence of the supernal pleasure, sheba atzmos ha'matzel, that is in the essence of the emanator, mamish, literally. And this little crumb of pleasure becomes, that is in the that is the pleasure of the entire creation, becomes nullified in it utterly. The ray of pleasure that's enclosed in Chochmah becomes utterly nullified in the source of pleasure that has not emanated, that is still in potential. That's where it all goes back to. Because the Kesser that's going into Chochmah is only a little ray, mina atzmos, from the essence of it, and it is enough to those who understand. Let's finish this small piece over here. Comes out. We see from here that there is 3 levels in pleasure. The ray of Chochmah as it is in the weekday. What's Chochmah as it in the weekday? Chochmah in the weekday is what? Is the Yud itself. It's already an idea. God, the innovation is not taking place. It's like God perceives the world, produces it with a certain concept. It's like a concept that is already, that you heard already, or that you produced a long time ago, or like he says, you receive the concept from someone else, you understand it. But it's still stagnant. And that's why in the 6 days of the week, you don't feel such pleasure, such divine pleasure. The light of Kesser is enclosed there as well. It's very concealed. And it's very contracted. Like it says, Chochmah comes from ayin, but through a tremendous contraction. So the Kesser is not felt in Chochmah. You feel is only the Chochmah. You feel the idea, not so much the pleasure of the idea. And the second level is when Kesser is flashing its lights into Chochmah with a powerful revelation. That happens at the point of innovation, when new ideas are flooding your mind. Whoa, Kesser is flooding your mind. But that's only a ray of Kesser. And that's Friday night. That's the Shabbos experience. That happens on Shabbos. The Chsiv, says, V'karasa l'Shabbos, you should call down to Shabbos. You're calling the pleasure. You're calling the Kesser into Chochmah. The pre-intellect is illuminating the intellect. The pre-intellect is firing off into the intellect. Boom, boom. It's like wow. V'agimel, and the third level, the essence of the supernal pleasure, as it is in an unexpressed, undrawn state, as it is sitting inside itself, submerged in the essence. Which is much higher than the ray of Kesser that shines in Chochmah. And when does that reveal itself? Shemeir, that shines. Umizgalim reveals itself b'yoyim de Shabbat, on the day of Shabbos. So for thousands of years, Jews experienced Shabbos, but no one knew until the Alter Rebbe came and gave such words and explanation to this experience. If you were a very big tzaddik, then you felt it in your soul, but the Alter Rebbe puts it into words. Alkein oimrim uz. That's why Shabbos day, Friday night we don't say uz tisaneg al Hashem, but Shabbos day we say uz tisaneg al Hashem. Uz pasuk zed, the uz tisaneg al Havayah. Then you will read lamayla mikol shem Havayah, because Friday night is still part of Havayah. It's the thorn of the Yud. Friday night. Shabbos day is above the whole name of Havayah. Al Havayah, on top of Havayah. Keniskalial, like we said earlier, V'dai L'Maven is enough to those who understand. After this, now we're going to understand, he says, the root of the 3 meals of Shabbos in general. So he's in the next piece, he's going to explain what I already said earlier, how when you produce something, there is a certain pleasure that has been, that becomes the soul of everything that you're doing, that is the drive of everything you're doing, the undercurrent. And that's why you only have happiness when you see something that is consistent with what you wanted. But as great as that is, there is the after pleasure that happens even after you're finished and you got that initial pleasure. There is a next stage of pleasure that kicks in, which is when you're relaxing. And that's a more distant type of an experience. And we're going to leave this Be'ezus Hashem for next week to conclude.